Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Cherry Bekaert's Digital Journeys podcast. My name is Dan Mitzenmacher, and I'm pleased to host today's episode, the third and final of this three-part series around ERP rescue and recovery. In our first episode, we gave a high-level overview of ERP project failures and challenges and some of the early signs warnings of some of those ERP project failures. In our second episode, we dove more into the alignment of ERP strategy, stakeholder buy-in, and change management. Finally, in today's session, we'll speak about ERP system integration and customization, and we'll address some of the risk assessment and mitigation planning that we use with clients in their rescue and recovery efforts. I'm rejoined with my colleague, Jim Holman, Director of Strategy and Operations within Digital Transformation Services. We're both part of Cherry Bekaert's digital advisory practice, where we guide our clients forward in their digital transformation journey. Jim, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, Jim. Well, let's dive into some of the aspects of integration and customization in an ERP project. Jim, how do you help clients ensure their ERP system integrates with their overall landscape of applications and help to drive operational efficiency?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one of the items that we had talked about in a previous session of this podcast is in really understanding your inventory of systems. What does your technology ecosystem look like? If you're just replacing an ERP and it already sits with stablemates within the client's ecosystem, there may be existing integrations that have to be thoroughly understood before a new system is placed and expects to work seamlessly. Other solutions, perhaps a CRM, for example, may not be integrated to the legacy ERP, but the client's expectation is that the new ERP will integrate. So you could be dealing with a situation where the existing solution lacks an integration, but the expectation is that one needs to be built. So really making sure that before you get started, the solutions are going to be compatible with each other, and that there's plenty of time for integration testing. With regards to compatibility, we've seen existing solutions that lack open API standards, which means you could have to resort to some more expensive and more risky integration technologies, such as robotic process automation, for example, and direct interfaces within the platform database. None of those things are really desirable if you can get away with it. And then finally, once you decide how you're going to integrate and what data is going to pass back and forth, understanding how the data is going to be controlled and secured along the way in the event that one of the solutions is not on-premise, it's in a different cloud. We see cloud-to-cloud data governance projects go sideways if organizations aren't prepared for what they're up for.
Yeah, I think integration of data really is just another piece of the process being realized through data flowing from system to system. So, I think knowing your processes and really having those mapped out with clarity on how the data transforms across systems is really, really important. Jim, let's dive into customization. This seems to be, a heart of many issues on ERP implementations is trying to customize a system exactly to a client's needs. How do you help clients anticipate and manage customizations throughout an ERP implementation?
Yeah, I think customizations with an ERP is a section in a podcast all its own. Every project where a client, especially that's moving from an older ERP, where 10, 20 years ago that was normal, that because there weren't open API standards. What we want to do is to make sure that clients coming from a custom solution understand that with excess customizations comes increased complexity, higher costs, and they may make themselves ineligible for those rolling every 6-month updates that the provider is going to offer. We want them to focus on what are your true, unique functional requirements, and to leverage standard features whenever possible. When a client has a unique requirement that they're just used to, we want to challenge them sometimes. Here's that tough love to have the client self-assess and say, does this customization, does it make them unique in the marketplace? Does it make them a best of breed provider? Does it make their goods or services higher quality? If not, they really should consider adopting and adhering to, say, standard features and best practices. And then lastly, we really want to prioritize those critical customizations and enhancements. For example, if there is a regulatory consideration that really is non-negotiable, those are things that are truly critical and must be adhered to. Are there specific customers that require, for example, packaging material, labels, different types of instructions that be placed within a packaging set when goods are being shipped out? Those are really things that must be accommodated. And those really have to be the basis for anything less than that really needs to be considered as optional. Dan, do you find that there's other things that organizations should consider that perhaps they're not when they are moving from a custom solution to one that maybe isn't custom?
Yeah, Jim, you talked about moving from an old system to a new one. And I think oftentimes, clients start with trying to recreate a process the way that they're currently doing it today. So I think the first thing to do in an ERP implementation is to look at the inherent capabilities of the software and try to leverage those as much as possible. Try not to customize. But obviously there's complexity there. And, the reason for the customization initially was to, try to address a unique process. So looking at workarounds, looking at different process changes that you can make in enabling that requirement in a different way, utilizing as much of the inherent capabilities as possible. And then where it doesn't work, where there's just not a fit within the software, oftentimes there's alternative off-the-shelf solutions that you could plug in as well and try to meet those requirements as well. So before heading the route of customization first mentality, I just really recommend starting with what's in the software, what are our workarounds, and what other alternatives are there out there. All right, Jim. Well, we talked about these ERP projects and really, the risk that they carry. And so, managing that risk is really important to an ERP project and really the role of your project management capability within the project. How do you work with clients in developing that risk assessment and risk mitigation plans throughout their ERP implementation? And then when they're having issues, how do you work with them through their rescue and recovery process?
The best time to engage with clients on the risk assessment and mitigation plans are obviously before go live. When we're working with an organization, especially a very complex one or heavily regulated or both, we make sure that a proper go live readiness assessment should be formulated about midway through the implementation to make sure that you're not just addressing hot button issues. So for example, what we're trying to look for is, are there particular areas of business disruption that if they occur, will have a material or financial impact on the organization? For example, we've all heard about I think it was the late 90s with Hewlett Packard going live onto SAP, where their ink business selling printer cartridges, that part of the business couldn't invoice for 3 months. Some really disruptive areas within the business are critical areas where you want to focus. The only way to do that is to really outline and understand the processes that are going to be tested And what happens if, for example, what if you can't pay vendors for a week? Well, ultimately, there's certain areas there that you could be in limp mode and you could survive. Other areas, for example, about not being able to accept customer orders, not being able to ship product, ironically, are going to be much more important within a risk assessment and risk mitigation plan. If you can't send an invoice for a week, certainly your financial stakeholders may be more concerned about it. But ultimately, if you can't place purchase orders, you can't receive products, you can't take customer orders, you can't ship products, those are all interacting your trading partners and will have long downstream effects. So what we want to do is to make sure that clients understand this as they go into testing and as they go into training, which areas that are going to be more important than others. Because certainly a month-end close happens at the end of the month. There are certain areas that if we have to defer and they're not quite ready, those are areas where there's just less risk. Second is we want to understand what are the escalation procedures and the rules of engagement with regards to a cutover. The reason that we do that is we want to make sure that the solution provider has an on-site presence during not just cutover, but the first month end. So when we have those types of environments where there's a cutover and the provider does not have the right level of expertise on site, what we find is an organization will stop their processing in a new system simply because they lack information. There's an area that wasn't tested. The ERP could be up and running fine, but the users, when they lack confidence, when they lack comfort in training, rather than make a mistake, will stop their process. So that particular type of logjam can cause an ERP failure where there wasn't one to begin with. So Dan, do you find that organizations are well prepped for what to do if something, a failure point actually occurs?
Yeah, that's always a challenge, Jim. Really, in an ERP project, and especially around migration time, you have to expect the unexpected and really prepare with contingency and backup plans throughout, really every step of the migration process. So, you have a go live date and you're targeted for that, and you're starting to migrate your data. Challenges happen, and you identify some complexities in the data, potentially some technical issues in the integration, and you got to be prepared to pivot and have those backup plans in place in case things don't go smoothly. Of course, you want to test as much as possible to limit those surprises, but be prepared when there are, because no doubt they do happen at times.
Yep.
All right, Jim. Well, you've been a part of a lot of ERP projects and come in and help clients get through some difficult times. So can you share some of your stories on how you've gone through that recovery process and the lessons you've learned from those experiences?
Yeah, I think when, we all see these scary statistics about ERP failures. And I think one area where we talk with clients is, how do you define what an ERP failure is? It used to be, for example, an on-premise solution where the system didn't function. There was a software or a server failure. But in reality, ERP is so expensive and disruptive. And as we mentioned in the previous podcast, where it's expensive and disruptive when it goes well. I think we really have to look at, what does failure mean to an organization? Is it because, for example, it didn't meet the goals and expectations? It's such a significant investment. What if it doesn't live up to your expectations? Is that considered a failure? We had a digital signage client that it turns out that failure was that they were not able to fully move off of their order management system, which was in QuickBooks. The expectation was that 100% of QuickBooks was going to be replaced with a new ERP solution. And quietly at Go Live, the order management team decided to not use the new ERP system because, for a variety of reasons, they kept it on QuickBooks, and there was a definite disruption with regards to manual processes when the new ERP had to be updated by hand from shipments and billings that were still happening in the old system. So that really not just adds manual processes because you're keying in transactions into the old system and then rekeying them into the new ERP. Integration was never in scope for that project. But at a high level, holistically, you're missing that automation. You're missing those efficiencies and economies of scale that you're not achieving. And then finally, you're not able to take advantage of technology that your customers are expecting. In this case, automated order acknowledgments via EDI. That was just not happening because the new system of record was not being utilized. Next, identifying quickly the issues that are open and are going to be disruptive. For example, we have many clients that go through user acceptance testing, and that when a user discovers a gap, that the gap isn't communicated because there's a syndrome called testing fatigue, which is they're testing so much that they don't want to report what they consider a minor error or defect because it's going to stop the testing process, especially when go live is just around the corner. So in the case of our digital signage client, the inside sales process owner was frankly not on board. They didn't feel like that their needs were fully considered. They thought the new ERP was hard to use. It was certainly more complex. But rather than communicate defects and deficiencies within testing, they went ahead with the go live anyway. And as soon as there were operational difficulties from the inside sales team, immediately they reverted to their old system of record. And frankly, this wasn't communicated. So you have a couple of areas that really yield signs and stop signs were just plowed forward. In this particular case, what did Cherry Bekaert do to get this back on track? So we were brought in the initial phases to help the client select a new ERP. But when they started the implementation, they went forward on their own. And we were brought in about, midway through the project for a checkpoint. And then we were also brought in about 2 weeks after cutover. And this 2 weeks after cutover is where we had to circle the wagons, meet with the C-suite, specifically the COO, to understand what are the defects that are missing from the ERP. And how can we quickly reassess these functional and key requirements to understand what's missing. So it turns out that there was a gap that was not fully addressed due to defects in requirements gathering initially, but in user acceptance testing. So we had existing relationships with these third-party providers. So we were able to escalate a new vendor proof of concept to trial sales workflow that was going to be needed in this situation. Those gaps were identified and mitigated. The client did an escalated user acceptance testing and then made a decision to deploy. Now, this was after go live, and all of that took place in about 2 weeks. This just caused trauma and distress with a client that, frankly, had they gathered requirements more thoroughly, had they done better user acceptance testing, we believe that would have been, it was an unnecessary mini disaster. So Dan, as a follow-up, why is it important to seek strong executive support and get commitments for the appropriate level of resource allocation to participate in these implementations?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, executives play a key role in, kind of ensuring the success of a project. And, first you mentioned resources, having the right folks available for the project and allocated at the right times. Obviously, they have to juggle their day-to-day responsibility of a job or be pulled out of some of their tasks. And so the executives can really help deal with the competing priorities of the organization and make sure that they are aligned to the project at the right times. It's a big spend for a project, so having them allocated at the right times is very important. having the executives have visibility of the status of the project to help manage the risks that we talked about, to understand those risk factors and guide some of the key decisions out of it. And then finally, from an executive standpoint, I think really being the vision and providing the guidance of being a change advocate throughout the implementation, because really, expect that the end result of this ERP implementation is of a unified and integrated system is really based off of the vision of the executive team and the direction that they're going. So really having that strong commitment up front and their ability to navigate the resource needs of the project is really important to a project's success. Well, Jim, thanks again for today's discussion on ERP rescue and recovery. We covered some areas around system integration, customization, as well as overall risk assessment and risk mitigation planning. This wraps up our 3-part series on making the most out of your ERP system and the different ways which we approach rescue and recovery efforts. Please reach out to Jim or I if you have any questions about your ERP transformation or issues that you're having with an ERP project. We talked about a number of different ways that Cherry Bekaert could help, from a project management capability, providing project assurance or independent verification and validation throughout an ERP project, and helping come in after an ERP go live and assess the situation and help put things back on track after a troubled implementation. Thanks again for tuning in to Cherry Bekaert's digital podcast series, and please be sure to like and subscribe to follow along for additional content such as this. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Dan.